Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin my late show, I just want to acknowledge that I'm joined this week by my daughter, Jada, and it's really happy to have my 12-year-old out here with me for the week, so I just want to give a quick shout-out to her. I was also honored this week to be able to host the U18 Shaunavon Badgers hockey team here in Ottawa. We had a quick little tour on the floor this morning. Really enjoyed doing that. They got a game tonight at 10 o'clock against the Ottawa Sting. I believe they are a Rep B level team, so looking forward to that game tonight. When I got up and asked a question of the Minister of Natural Resources, it was in regards to the government's emissions cap. And when I talked to people from the area around Shaunavon in particular, and even these young men who are here tonight, or earlier today, they talked a lot about what the future for our country looked like. And when we look at policies like an emissions cap like this government is implementing, we've seen already with independent analysis that it's going to be a production cap. And I know that the parliamentary secretary, when he stands up, he's going to say, well, no, it's a cap on emissions, it's not a cap on production. Well, the proof is in the pudding, and we've seen multiple reports already by several groups saying that the emissions cap will amount to 1 million barrels per day reduction in oil production. So we're already seeing that there's going to be a reduction in the amount of oil that is produced in this country by the emissions cap. Now, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because 1 million barrels per day would amount to a 1% hit in Canada's GDP. Now, on Monday coming up, Mr. Speaker, we're going to hear from the Finance Minister finally on the supplementary estimates. And she is talking about, well, she hasn't told us what the deficit's going to be, but she said because the PBO said that we have a room for a 1.5% swing in GDP, that everything's fine, it doesn't matter how big the deficit is, it'll be okay. Well, the reality is when you implement policies that blow a 1% hole already right off the top before you even get to this 1.5%, you know you're already going to be operating within a very, very tight margin. What's going to happen to the spending power of the average Canadian after this production cap hits Canadians fully, it's going to amount to $420 a month per Canadian household in disposable income that they will not have access to. They're going to lose $420 per month based on those numbers. And that's important because when we look at the forecast for the cost of food for 2025, grocery prices are going to go up on average $800 per Canadian family. So when you factor bad policy A with bad policy B, with things like the carbon tax, with things like the liberal fuel standards, we're continuing to see a continual assault on the cost of living for Canadians. And when we look at the energy security of our country, we're seeing around the world right now that energy security is of utmost importance. And when you see what the oil and gas sector does for Canada, the strategic advantage that we actually have with our natural resources, and you see policies put in place like the emissions cap, they're going to cost 115,000 jobs for Canadian workers. We see the 1% hit in GDP. We see the multiple billion dollars that are going to be lost from the Canadian economy because of the singular bad policy. But you add that on top of the other pancaking of bad policies from this government, Canadians are going to be worse off. So how can the government seriously look Canadians in the face, Canadians who are looking at their future in their small towns, but even in our country at large, and say that this is going to be a good policy that's going to hamper and strike down the future of Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as to the Minister for Fitness and Amateur Sport.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join my colleague in welcoming his daughter Jada to the House of Commons and to Ottawa, and certainly as well I'd like to join my colleague in welcoming the Shaunavon Badgers to Ottawa. And since there's no Milton team in the tournament, I presume I can cheer for the Shaunavon Badgers. Is it the Badgers, Jeremy? Badgers. Okay. So I'm a big fan of sports, and I love that. That we celebrate that collectively and did last week when our Olympic and Paralympic teams were here. A nice moment of nonpartisan, celebration here in the House of Commons for everyone. But Mr. Speaker, on to the issue of the day, which is the emissions cap that our government has proposed. Very proudly, we are one of the first oil and gas producing nations to propose an emissions cap. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge one thing that my colleague said. He said that I would say that it's not a production cap. He's indeed correct. It's not a production cap on oil and gas production. It actually accommodates a more than 16% increase in production. But what we know about many of the products in the in the oil patch. Certainly not all of them. Some of them have the highest emissions intensity in the world of certain types of projects. Those mostly include projects that are not in the province of where my colleague resides, mostly in the oil sands in Alberta, where bitumen production, the emissions intensity in the oil sands has actually gone up, and they've actually acknowledged themselves they need to have an emissions cap. We can have a conversation as to where that should be, but it's the case that no sector in Canada should be entitled to unlimited pollution. I don't believe that any sector should be able to operate in the absence of any regulations around how much they pollute. I am also, similarly, like my colleague, concerned about the future of our planet and our country. I'm concerned about our economy, and I'm concerned that climate change is having a really negative impact on our economy. Food reports have come out from various organizations and agencies recently, and all of those have pointed to climate change as a leading cause of food inflation. The Conservatives have recently kind of leaned into the direction of misinformation when they've talked about the difference in food inflation rates between Canada and the United States. I'd like to call them out on that because they continually provide false information, false narratives around the difference in food inflation between Canada and the United States. Canada and the United States have very, very similar rates of food inflation. United States, in the absence of a federal price on pollution, here in Canada, they have a federal price on pollution. And all of these things are very measurable. It's not a new thing. We've been pricing carbon in Canada in various ways for over a decade. And we know that the so-called Axe the Tax campaign, if we were to reduce or eliminate carbon pricing entirely in Canada, it might save Canadians about 50 cents on $100 worth of groceries. But it would also cost them the Canada carbon rebate, Mr. Speaker. So back to the issue of the day, which is the cap on emissions in the oil and gas sector. We have to use absolutely all of our tools in the toolbox to combat pollution, and on the 4th of November, our government introduced the proposed regulations to cap greenhouse gas pollution from the oil and gas sector, which is going to drive innovation and create jobs in the oil and gas sector. And we've been very, very clear the pollution cap will work to curb pollution and not production. It's going to drive investment. It's going to create good new jobs. It's going to also grow a strong economy and a greener economy, and it's going to encourage many of those energy products that we need for both our economy, our day-to-day lives, to heat our homes, to drive our cars, to deliver our goods. We also need to ensure that those emissions go down. But we also have to keep reminding Conservatives that the cap on emissions will also allow production and actually encourage production to expand by 16% by 2030. So, Mr. Speaker, I have more to say, but I know there's going to be an opportunity for a rebuttal. So I'd just like to once again say these regulations would set reduction levels at 35% below 2019 levels by 2030, and that's a good thing for future generations.
Before I pass on to the honourable member, I do want to just point out that one of the reasons why I give a hand signal that might have been misinterpreted. Although we're all Badgers fans, and that there was a really respectful debate between the two members, I just want to mention that it's important not to refer to members by their first names or by their last names in this place. Out of respect, we refer to them by their position, title, or the name of their riding. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
All right, well, Mr. Speaker, so we're already starting to see the effects of these bad policies the government's putting in place. Enbridge is investing $700 million in an American pipeline down in Texas. Shortly after the American election, TC Energy's approved over $1 billion worth of capital spending on 3 natural gas plants. Now, we know that Canada has a strategic advantage for producing natural gas, but in particular for producing liquefied natural gas. We have a cold climate, as we're experiencing outside right now, which is strategically advantageous for trying to produce it. We're also the closest point to Europe. We're the closest point to Asia. So logistically, it makes the most sense to be producing LNG in Canada. But if we have our main energy producing companies going down to the United States, and these companies also are the largest investors in wind turbines, solar farms, things like that, they're chasing that investment out. There's going to be nothing left when this government's done.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as to the Minister for Sport and Physical Activity.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague won't be surprised to hear that I disagree that effective climate policy, climate action, emissions reductions are chasing away investment. They don't. They do the opposite. In fact, the world wants cleaner and greener electricity. The world demands cleaner and greener energy, oil products, and fuels, and that's where we've got to go. Many of the oil companies, some of them who the member mentioned, are doing a lot of these things on their own. Certainly with respect to the LNG sector, they are constantly looking for ways to innovate and to create a greener, cleaner fuel supply chain. But you know, I'd ask my colleague from Saskatchewan if he shares the sentiment of the Premier of Saskatchewan, who has said that he's considered alternatives to carbon pricing, but decided against those because he's decided they're too expensive. Or more recently, he said, and I quote, "People often come to me to say Saskatchewan has the highest carbon emissions per capita in Canada, but I don't care."